Welcome to See You Boulder Where You Are. We're here for our 5th episode. We changed locations this week, and we're actually on top of the Champion Center on the rooftop. Incredible views of Boulder from up here. It looks a little different today. We have quite a bit of haze from the wildfires that are happening out west in Colorado. But still an incredible view, and we're super excited to be here. We are practicing all social distancing guidelines, all health recommendations, including keeping apart from one another. Masks are being worn by everybody in the room at all times, except when we're speaking. And for those of us that are actually talking, we do have a plexiglass barrier between us to ensure that we're keeping each other safe. This week, we have some really exciting stuff going on, and we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. But this series has actually done an incredible job of sharing some of the exciting stories and innovations that are coming out of CU Boulder on a regular basis. This is our 5th episode. We have one more in this series for next week, and we encourage you to tune into that as well. But one of the great things about this being a live event is that we can talk about relevant topics as they're happening. And as I'm sure all of you know, things are changing on a daily basis. This week was no exception. We saw this week that the Pac-12 and the Big 12 athletic conferences all postponed their fall sports across the board. This obviously was a big deal, and we're still understanding what it means for the future. But one of the great things about what we're doing today is we'll have a chance to talk about that and other topics. And I'm joined today, as usual, by our Chancellor, Dr. Phil DeStefano. Phil, it's great to see you here again, straight through the plexiglass. How are you doing these days?
I'm doing fine, Ryan, and you?
I'm doing very well, and I'll tell you what, I really look forward to coming to campus for these episodes so that I get a chance to actually interact with people outside of my family, which I do love, by the way, but it is nice to have a little bit of interaction across the work environment. So how are things on campus these days?
Well, Ryan, as you said, this has been a busy week, and the decision by the Pac-12 and then later by the Big Ten to postpone fall athletics was certainly a difficult decision for all of us to make, the presidents and chancellors of the Pac-12 institutions. But we made that decision based upon our top priority, and that top priority is the health and safety of our student athletes. And at this time, we did not feel, after we received information from our medical team, and we have 3 University of Colorado individuals on that medical team, that the recommendation was to postpone. But I'm hoping that we'll work out something in the fall so that we can have football in the spring. But as you said, it's also been a busy year. Here it is, 2020, and we're halfway over the year on the way to 2021. We've seen, the worst pandemic since the early 1900s, and we've also seen quite a bit of student activism on campuses and within cities throughout the country. But if you think about it, our college campuses have always been a catalyst for social change. And, many of us remember that social change during the 60s, but you can look back to the University of Colorado when George Norland was president. And George Norland had to stand up to the governor of the state of Colorado because the governor wanted President Norland to, rid the campus of Catholics and Jews. And Norland stood his ground and did the right thing. And as a result, the university lost funding that year. But to me, that was, one episode in the history of the University of Colorado that showed social justice, social change, doing the right thing.
Well, it's relevant for the topic today in terms of what you're talking about with President Norland, because today we're going to be joined by communications professor Larry Fry, who's going to be talking exactly about what you just mentioned, the role of universities in social change. And so we'll look forward to that in just a minute, but we're going to introduce him here in a few. But I want to take it back to Phil, because I know, Chancellor, you have been thinking a lot about the role the universities play and what we have coming up this fall. You want to talk a little bit about the social change and some of the things taking place?
Sure. One of the things going on now, Ryan, and it's been going on for the last 2 years, and we've implemented a number of changes. But we have a group of some of our top faculty with our provost, Russ Moore, working on what we call academic futures. And what's the future of the university? And so we're constantly looking at ways of making changes as we look toward the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And certainly with this pandemic, we're also taking a close look. And one of the, I think, top areas that we're looking at here at the University of Colorado is making sure that we put the public good back into a public university like ours. And I'm really pleased at what the faculty are doing here. And they're looking at ways of doing more interdisciplinary education, not only for our graduate students, but for our undergraduate students, because we feel that's one of the best ways that students learn is through interdisciplinary education. And to go back to Norlin, if I can very quickly, I was reading not too long ago letters from President Norlin to the faculty. And one of the things that he was most concerned about was the proliferation at the time of departments on a university campus. He thought that there should be much more interaction among faculty from different areas. And sorry to say that if President Norlin had to see, what we're doing today, with 70 to 80 departments on campus, he'd be quite shocked probably by that. But we're taking a lesson from Norlin and how we're expanding that interdisciplinary education across the campus.
Well, and one of the things that I think a lot of people point to these days, Chancellor, is the importance of big data in everything we do. And data, I think, is wonderful at helping us make some decisions, but there's no question that the humanities and liberal arts and the thinking that goes behind those decisions are critically important as well.
That's you're extremely right about that, Ryan. When we look at solving complex problems, they really can't be solved by one discipline alone. And we really need to bring in not only our sciences and engineering faculty, but also our social science and humanities faculty to really take a look at how we solve problems. I'll give you a quick example. As we look at a critical problem here at the university and universities across the country, it's the mental health of our students. I'm very concerned about the health and welfare of our students and also our faculty and staff. To solve that problem, it really takes faculty and ideas and research coming from so many different areas. And we have a new institute, a wellness institute on campus that really brings in that interdisciplinary look to health and wellness.
Well, and our speaker today, who we're going to hear a presentation from here in just a minute, and then we'll have some open live Q&A. And we want to encourage you throughout the session today, through the Zoom tool, the Q&A tool, to submit your questions during the presentation so we can address them after, or after when we get into the Q&A, questions for our presenter as well as for our chancellor here. Today, we're going to be joined by Dr. Larry Fry. Dr. Larry Fry has some really interesting insights into everything that you were just talking about, Chancellor. He's a professor and associate chair of graduate studies in the Department of Communications, and his research focuses squarely on everything we just talked about. So this is social justice through communications.
Hello, I'm Larry Fry, a professor in the Department of Communication here at CU Boulder. I want to thank Chancellor DeStefano for inviting me to talk about promoting social justice through communication research, which for the past 25 years has been the central focus of my scholarship. Let's talk a little bit about social justice itself. As I'm sure you will agree, we live in perilous times, plagued by pervasive and profound social problems. One of the most important set of problems involves social justice. And there's a lot of debate about that term, but I used this definition, that people are not discriminated against because of class, race, sexual orientation, and similar identity markers. They receive equitable treatment with regard to opportunities and resources, and they have their human rights and freedoms respected. Let me just offer a couple of quick examples of each of those so that we understand what we're talking about. Let's start with racial, gender, and sexual orientation discrimination, just as examples of those. Racial discrimination, and more specifically, anti-blackness, has a long history here and in other countries. The killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer has certainly taken center stage, sparking national and international protests against this lethal form of discrimination against African Americans, who comprise 13% of the U.S. population, but since 2013 represent 28% of the people killed by police. The 15 to 26 million protesters supporting Black Lives Matter's goals of preventing police violence and eradicating the systemic racism that perpetuates it and the many other social injustices that African Americans face makes BLM the largest social movement in history. Those protests, of course, are occurring during a pandemic that has dramatically highlighted long-standing race and class-based health and economic inequality, with, as just one example, U.S. coronavirus mortality rates being 3 times higher for blacks compared to whites. Gender discrimination, of course, is also still rampant. For instance, although women comprise half of the U.S. workforce and, compared to men, have more undergraduate and graduate degrees, they make 81 cents for every dollar that men make. If the pace of change during the last 50 years continues, women will not achieve pay equity with men until 2059, with black women not achieving that goal until 2130, and Latina women waiting until 2224. As just a final example, although there has been progress made regarding the rights of people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning, such as the legalization of same-sex marriage, U.S. federal law still allows discrimination by landlords, stores, restaurants, hotels, and federally funded organizations, including, by the way, hospitals, colleges, and adoption agencies. Elsewhere, that type of discrimination is so insanely extreme that 52 countries imprison people. 7 can give life sentences. 1 country allows physical torture of those convicted, and 8 countries can sentence people to death. Inequitable resources and opportunities have reached an epic scale worldwide. As just sort of a couple of examples, 40 to 60 million people are living in extreme poverty. Half of the world's population does not have access to essential health care. Less than 1% of the people in the world have a net worth that exceeds $1 million, but control 44.8% of the world's wealth, with, by the way, the combined wealth of 8 men equaling that of 3.6 billion people, comprising the poorest half of humanity. Human rights and freedoms, the dire conditions in low and middle income countries have fueled an unprecedented global refugee crisis, with 30 million refugees, more than half being under the age of 18, and 70.8 million forced from their homes by persecution or conflict. 40 million people are trapped in modern forms of slavery, forced labor, forced marriage. Finally, across the world, threats to democratic institutions and practices are increasing rapidly. The independent non-government organization Freedom House's yearly report on freedom in the world noted a 13-year global decline in democracy due to, among other things, the rise of reactionary parties and movements in many nations, and the increasing number of authoritarian and right-wing governments that have taken steps to restrict civil liberties. In the United States, the report noted the erosion of democratic norms fueled by President Trump's attacks on the news media, on an independent judiciary, and on ethnic, racial, and religious minorities. As these examples demonstrate, and unfortunately, I could spend the entire time of this talk giving more examples, there's no shortage of social justice problems that desperately need attention. One might think that members of the Academy would be at the forefront of confronting social justice and other social problems. After all, historically, many U.S. colleges and universities, such as the colonial colleges, the land-grant universities, and urban research universities, were established with at least part of their mission generating knowledge to better their communities. Although I would be remiss if I didn't point out and acknowledge that those communities meant white communities, right? And that U.S. universities, especially early ones, benefited and supported slavery. Funding of professor salaries, for examples, came from that. And many universities, including CU Boulder, by the way, sits on Native American land. Many of the universities, especially those that we consider to be elite, drifted away from their civic mission to become research-intensive universities, which is what CU Boulder is, that privilege research-advancing scholarly disciplines. This research is conducted about academic disciplinary issues for a very small insular group of scholars rather than research that aids communities within which universities are embedded. That discipline-oriented research has privileged theory. And if you go back to the etymology of the word theory, it means contemplation, speculation, looking at. So scholars are supposed to be spectators who look at and theorize phenomena, but not affect what they study, and they are unconcerned about whether their theories really have any practical value at all. Of course, that research has been supported by quite a bit of grant money, right? And CU has attracted a record $631 million in annual research funding last year. Toward the end of the 20th century, scholars, practitioners, and the public alike expressed serious concerns about academic research being divorced from contemporary community and social problems. That criticism led to a concerted effort to revitalize U.S. universities' civic mission by encouraging what Boyer in 1990 called engaged scholarship or engaged research, and it goes by some other name, civic community research. And that type of research involves scholars interacting with community stakeholders to produce knowledge that solves community problems and serves the public good. Today, engaged scholarship is woven into disciplines across the social sciences, humanities, and physical sciences, with a Google Scholar search of that term yielding 3.5 million citations, and a Google search showing 365 million. All of the faculty members in my department, and the vast majority of graduate students, not just in my department, but also in the college of CMCI, conduct engaged research, and that's fantastic. That's great. But however, as the number of citations suggests, that term has become so elastic that it denotes virtually any interactions that scholars have with community members. Moreover, most of the engaged research conducted does not address social justice problems. A much more focused form of engaged research that does address those problems is activist research, which merges research and political activity to study direct actions that researchers take to support a political position. Although activist research can be conducted to support oppression, scholars could act to restrict LGBTQ plus rights, most activist research promotes progressive social justice politics and policies. Communication activism research for social justice, communication activism for short, or CAR, is my contribution to the conversation about promoting activist research in my discipline. Communication activism research involves scholars collaboratively engaging in activism with oppressed communities and/or with activist groups and organizations to design, facilitate, and study their communication interventions to advance those communities' social goals. CAR first builds trusting relationships with community partners from the ground up, listening deeply to and understanding their social justice needs and the systemic structures and practices preventing those needs from being realized. CAR scholars first conduct the type of research about their community partners and their social justice needs that virtually all scholars conduct, observational research, what I have called third-person perspective research, because researchers stand outside the stream of human activity and observe. They describe, they interpret or explain, sometimes they critique, and sometimes they offer recommendations. But they stand outside that stream, not affecting it, not getting into it, not intervening, not facilitating, not trying to, for example, sticking with the metaphor, to build a dam. Of course, there are different types of interventions that we could talk about, right? So some scholars have intervened to aid corporations, and in many cases, that's great work. For example, one of my colleagues, Stan Dietz, ex-colleague, he is professor emeritus, tried to promote democracy in corporations. Others do civic engagement and civic interventions, right? And many of those civic interventions could be social justice in the sense that I've talked about, but they aren't necessarily civic, they aren't necessarily social justice interventions. Just as an example, most people would say that a civic intervention to encourage more people to vote is incredibly valuable. But from a social justice perspective, having more people vote is not positive per se. It depends what they vote for. If they vote to discriminate against people because of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and all of the other identity markers that we could talk about, it's not better to have more people vote. I want to offer you some examples of communication activism research, and in a kind of blatant appropriation of corporate sort of policies, I'm featuring those studies from 3 books on communication activism that I have co-edited with Kevin Carnegie from Suffolk University. And I'll just talk about a couple of these and offer you some examples of them. And I've organized them by the type of communication intervention that people use. We are focused on how people talk. And so what we do is we try to help people to sort of talk better. For example, communication assessment instruments. Mark Orby, as just one example, has created an instrument to measure the civil rights health of communities. And he tested and assessed 3 Michigan communities and then helped those community members to dialogue about policies that they could institute to make their communities healthier with regard to civil rights. Many communication scholars offer communication skills training or workshops. Papa et al., for example, started a small business that provided livable wages to people living in poverty. And they offered interpersonal communication skills training to the employees who had to interact with customers. Sunwolf offered workshops that taught capital defense attorneys how to talk to potential jurors about death. You can't ask jurors directly about their views on the death penalty. So she devised a procedure where attorneys can talk about beliefs about death, and many of those beliefs are correlated with particular views of the death penalty so that the lawyers can identify and dismiss those who would support the death penalty. Kelly Brownlee, one of my MA students, offered workshops at the Boulder Public Library that taught immigrants about storytelling, and that concluded with a public event where participants shared stories about discrimination that they had experienced that was listened to by Boulder community members. Many colleagues have engaged in debates and dialogues. My colleague Leah Sprain here in the Department of Communication facilitates public dialogues about water rights, for example. Stephen Hartnett down at CU Denver had students in his communication course taught in a prison restage the Lincoln-Douglas debates about slavery. Those debates showed the attending prison administrators, guards, prisoners, and community members how the tropes of racism from them have carried through to today. Group communication facilitation. This is my area of expertise. My most recent research has involved facilitating board meetings and serving as an external evaluator of an intergenerational dance theater company that teaches at-risk children to share narratives about their life, including the discrimination that they've faced. Cox and Geiger facilitated communication in groups of middle school students and teachers to stop racist bullying that was occurring in one of those schools. Broome employed a computer-assisted group communication facilitation procedure to increase participation in Native American tribal governance. And interestingly enough, the reason why he used computer-mediated facilitation was because that particular procedure resonated with the values of Native Americans in the sense that people could post ideas without having to be identified personally. He's also used it, by the way, to promote peace between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots on Cyprus, working with the presidents of both of those countries to try to encourage peace. My colleagues in media have done a lot of intervening in terms of advocacy campaigns and potential products. Ryan et al.'s group conducts media campaigns to frame and gain positive news coverage of press communities' social justice needs. And one of those campaigns that supported a workplace gender discrimination lawsuit resulted in a positive U.S. Supreme Court decision, with the court citing the frames that Ryan et al.'s groups advocated. McHale, as a graduate student, made a documentary about an innocent man on death row in Missouri that was seen by members of the Missouri Supreme Court who freed him. By the way, that film has been remade with Danny Glover as the narrator. Performance and theater is also used a lot. Harder and et al. And her colleagues staged participatory theaters performed by young men and women in India, the first time that they had performed together to protest the practice of dowry. Political communication activity has also been a source of interventions. Hartnett, again, facilitated teach-ins, political art, marches, vigils, rallies, and other political activities in Champaign, Illinois, to protest the war on Iraq. And public relations has even been used. Drake employed those practices to try to shut down a confined animal feeding operation, a factory farm. Many of these studies have resulted in incredibly important outcomes, and I can name some other outcomes that have occurred as well. For example, communication activism research studies have helped to decrease human trafficking in South Asia by facilitating communication conferences for stakeholders. One has helped to improve the health care of 45,000 Hmong and other Highland people living in a refugee camp in Laos by offering culturally grounded health communication performances. Another, conducted by Beth Osnes in the Department of Theater here at CU Boulder, and one of her graduate students, replaced burning toxic open wood fires in indigenous Guatemalan Mayans' homes with fuel-efficient cook stoves by performing energy justice theater. Beth actually contracted with a company that produces fuel-efficient stoves and sells them to Mayans at cost. A researcher has aided the healing of Greensboro, North Carolina residents after a racist shooting incident by leading public dialogues. Researchers have helped to stabilize a nonprofit organization working to prevent sexual assault via their communication consulting. And the healthcare services for women who partner with women have been improved by offering communication workshops to a college healthcare center's providers. I've been talking about communication activism research, but I want to point out that I've also applied this perspective to pedagogy and to teaching. And I call it communication activism pedagogy, or CAP. And communication activism pedagogy teaches students to use their communication education to engage in collaborative action to promote oppressed communities and activist social justice goals through, for example, social justice activism service learning. Let me just conclude with a couple of final thoughts about this type of research. First, CAR connects scholars to oppressed communities and their social justice issues. It turns scholars into engaged citizens who are involved with their local communities. CAR scholars do not just study oppressed communities and their social justice issues. There's a lot of researchers who do that. CAR scholars engage in social justice activism to aid those communities. They intervene in ways to help. CAR scholar activists, as I call them, do not just engage in social justice activism, they study and they report their activism. I want to be very clear that I am first and foremost a scholar. If I wanted to be an activist, I probably wouldn't be giving this talk. I'd probably be protesting out there against CU Boulder. I'm sure we're making bombs somewhere on campus or something similar to that. That's not what I do. I'm not a protester. I'm a scholar who studies the type of activism that I engage in. Scholars, and this is a very important point, in the past have thought or hoped or relied on others to use their research to accomplish great things like social justice. But there's little evidence, from my perspective, that that actually happens. They're hoping that a difference will be made from their research. But CAR scholars promote social justice through their research. They use their research as a way to make a positive difference in people's lives who are affected by social injustice. And, as I've tried to point out here in this very brief talk, and I could offer a lot of other examples, CAR studies have and can contribute to achieving social justice. Let me conclude by saying that there are many reasons for why scholars, and not just communication scholars, should engage in activist research. It benefits communities, it benefits universities, it benefits the students who participate, it benefits lots of people. But it's not done simply because of the benefits. So communication activism research is a significant form of engaged scholarship that in the final analysis is the right thing to do. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the question and answer period.
We're going to be joined in just a second with the presenter that you just saw, Dr. Larry Fry, who's a professor of graduate studies in the Department of Communication. He's also a National Communication Association Distinguished Scholar. And this is an award that is bestowed on only a few people in this organization in their 100-year history. So we are very fortunate to have him joining us today. He's joining us via Zoom. Dr. Fry, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me, and thank you, Phil, for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Well, we really enjoy this opportunity to allow our audience members to ask some questions. So again, if you're joining us on the Zoom, please go into the Q&A part of the Zoom and submit your questions. We'll try and get through as many as we possibly can in the time we have allowed, and we'll answer them for you right here live and on Zoom. But before we do that, we do have a couple poll questions that we'd like to ask. We're going to start with one, and this should pop up on your screen, and we'd love to see your response here, just to see how much you're learning through this. Researchers should be observed and not affect the people, practices, etc., that are studied. Do you agree or disagree? So take a second, go ahead and make that answer on the screen, and we'll go ahead and move into our first question for Dr. Fry. Dr. Fry, what drew you into this type of research? Was it a certain experience that you had?
That's a great question. It actually was. I was doing primarily laboratory studies back in the 70s and early 80s, and I got a chance to do some ethnographic work at a residential facility for people with AIDS, and that was really the first work that I had done in the field, and it was a life-changing work in a lot of ways. One, it certainly affected me personally in terms of at that time people were dying pretty quickly from AIDS. About the average length of life was about 8 months once you had full-blown AIDS. And so just from a personal standpoint, I saw that researchers could work with, incredibly important topics and people and problems. And that led to being an advocate for Bonaventure House, the name of the facility was called, having media appearances, trying to deal with the stigma that people with AIDS faced at that time. And I put a lot of myself into that. And ever since then, I sort of committed to studying problems that were social justice based. I didn't have that term for it at the time, but as it turns out, those were the type of problems I wanted to focus on.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. I can imagine that would definitely get you passionate about the field that you work in. And
Absolutely.
From your presentation, I think that passion definitely shows. You've had a long career working in this field. So tell us a little bit. The question submitted is, why is scholarly research that addresses social justice problems important or valuable, especially now?
Well, I think one, as I tried to say in the talk, there are just so many social justice problems. Every time you turn on the news, TV, it seems like there's something else out there that is certainly affecting people and producing injustices. So I think on one level, it's just a matter of, what problems in our society are important, things like inequities, disparities, especially in this time period of COVID, which has really revealed in lots of ways how African Americans and other minorities are being affected at greater rates than people who are white. So I think that, there's an exigence of the present moment that needs to be dealt with in some ways. Every researcher makes their choice about what to focus on. There are a lot of other important issues in the world, no doubt, and problems and all sorts of things. But I think that some of the problems that I mentioned in the talk and many others that I could point to, for me, they rise to the top. And I think that as scholars, we have a lot to contribute, just as we do in terms of all sorts of things. How do diseases get solved? They get solved by researchers. How do we land people on the moon? And we do that through research. And CU has been at the forefront of a lot of that type of research. And it's also at the forefront of this type of research as well.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the emphasis on research, because one of the questions we got is, at a tier 1 research institution like CU Boulder, there is a heavy emphasis on applied or practical research. Should theoretical and conceptual research be equally valued?
Yeah, the question's a little odd in the sense that typically at these elite programs, research intensive, they tend to privilege more of conceptual research that's directed towards scholars in a particular discipline. Phil mentioned before that there are 80 different departments, and sometimes we're very isolated. And yeah, a lot of my research is produced mainly for the scholars in my field. So we've tended to not privilege applied research. I do think CU is very different because in a lot of ways it's had the sciences as a very strong component of the university. And the sciences are certainly conceptual and theoretical, but they are fundamentally concerned with being practical as well. And I think that ethos has sort of translated throughout the university. And I'm very appreciative of the scientists who work at CU for setting that pace.
So one of the questions that I think comes up often is, why is engagement on social justice issues so important for undergraduates in particular?
Well, we expose undergraduates to all sorts of things, and I'm a Big Tent person, so I think they ought to know things about business and business practices. They ought to know things about families and how families function. So there are a lot of things. Social justice is just one more of those sort of topics that's important for them to learn, just in terms of having, as you said earlier in the program, having a liberal arts education. But social justice is also important because of the significance of the problem and the opportunity for young people to contribute to it. If these kinds of changes are going to take place, if women are going to receive the same amount of dollars for the same amount of work that men do, it's going to be the next generation. And after that hopefully that sets that agenda and that accomplishes that goal. So I think making students, undergraduates, aware of those issues, their potential to have a say in those issues seems very important, both from a pedagogical standpoint, just as a form of education, but also a very practical matter in terms of how we produce the types of changes that we want to see occurring.
Well, we have another poll question we're going to jump to, and then I have a question for the Chancellor, and we're going to come back to you, Dr. Fry, here in just a minute with some more questions. Our second poll question is, scholars should not conduct research that involves them engaging in political activism. Agree or disagree? So take a second to answer that, and I'm going to bring our Chancellor back because we want to have an opportunity to ask a question for you, Chancellor. This is one that I think is relevant to the topic that we're talking about today. And in light of the university's commitment to social justice and the health of the campus community, why is CU Boulder holding in-person classes, especially given the health disparities related to race, class, and disability?
Great, and that's a great question, Ryan, and I thank the individual for asking that. First of all, let me back up a little bit about the types of classes that we're going to have on campus. 50% of our classes this fall will either be in-person or hybrid, and the other 50% will be by remote learning. And when we talk about students who will be spending the entire semester in in-person classes, these are mainly our first-year students living in the residence halls. And what we're doing with those first-year students is they'll be taking courses throughout the semester by cohorts, which means that the same, let's say 25 or 30 or 35 students will be in multiple courses together, which really reduces the density and will make sure that they are in classrooms that are much larger than a class for 25 or 30 students. They'll be socially distancing, they'll be wearing masks, there will be sanitizers in each classroom, and then after that class is over, that classroom will be cleaned before another class comes in. To do all of this, we're extending the day. Our classes will meet from 8 in the morning till about 10 o'clock at night, which is very different from the 8 to 4 or the 8 to 5 schedule. The other group of students that I mentioned, the hybrid students, these are students, and I'll give you an example of, let's say, 50 students in a hybrid class. 25 of those students would meet in person for 1 week, and then the other 25 would be meeting through remote. And then the following week that would change. And the idea there is to give students that in-person experience, especially our first-year students, and to do it in a safe way. The one thing that we heard from all of our students, but especially our first-year students coming in, is they would like to have as much of a college experience as possible, including in-person classes. So we are looking at the health and safety of individuals, whether they're taking in-person, hybrid, or remote, and that is a top priority for us.
Great, thank you, Chancellor. I have one more for you, and then Dr. Fry, I have 2 more questions for you, and we're going to try and move through these pretty fast to stay on time. So, Chancellor, with the big news coming out of the Pac-12 and Big Ten this week with the postponement of fall sports, that's often a big spirit-building time period for our students. Plus, we're not allowing a lot of any large events on campus, which has also been kind of a traditional way to build spirit. The question is, how does the campus continue to build school spirit during a time like this when we don't have things like athletics or other on-campus large events to rally behind?
Right, and the challenge, that's the challenge for us this fall. And our student affairs offices are working really closely with our student government leaders in looking at ways that we can have activities for small groups throughout the semester. The rec center will be open for students to use, but it'll be on a much limited basis. So as we go into the semester, we're going to look at small group activities for students both on and off campus, and again, keeping health and safety as the top priority.
Thank you, Chancellor. I appreciate that. Dr. Fry, before we get to your question, I want to talk about the results of one of our poll questions because I think it's relevant to the question I'm about to ask you here. And that is, the question was, scholars should not conduct research that involves them engaging in political activism. Of our audience out there, we had 44% agree with that and 56% disagree with that. So going to our question, and I'm going to read the question verbatim because I think it's appropriate. I'm old school, and in parentheses, very old. I was taught that to be a good researcher, you must retain your objectivity. If you get involved in the advocacy group you are studying, doesn't this impede your objectivity?
It's a great question. First of all, I'd like to say that, we've been trained how to be objective. That's not really a problem. We've received years and years of education about how to stand outside the stream of human events and describe and observe and critique and maybe even offer recommendations. So that skill doesn't go away when you get involved in things. That's true of field research in general, whether you're an advocate or not. You're immersed in the situations. You get to know people. That doesn't mean you're not, quote, objective. There are plenty of times when I've worked with activist groups where I've had to critique what they do. And I do that. And they may not be happy with the critique, but that's what a scholar does, is find out what is going on, interpret it, and then make recommendations. So I don't think that it is old school to think that if you are an advocate or in the field or involved with people that somehow you will, quote, go native, almost never coming back, that you will just be an advocate for that group. That's not been my experience. Our work as scholars lies more in trying to involve ourselves in the lives of others while still being objective than it does in terms of not involving ourselves in the lives of others.
Well, Dr. Fry, I think that's actually a wonderful question to end on. And I wanted to thank you again for joining us today. Really wonderful to chat with you and learn a little bit about the incredible research that you've been engaged in. Chancellor, it's been wonderful to have you here as well, and it's always wonderful to highlight some of our incredible faculty.
Yes, and Larry, I want to thank you for spending time with us today. You've been a terrific faculty member on campus. Congratulations on your lifetime achievement, and thank you for all you do for the Department of Communication.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for being so supportive of this type of research and other types as well. This has been the most facilitating university I've been at.
So I know we weren't able to get to all of the questions submitted. We had quite a few. Obviously, a lot of folks really engaged in the topic. So we'll try and answer the questions. We will post this along with all the rest of our episodes on the Chancellor's website, colorado.edu/chancellor. You can go watch any of the previous episodes and this one included. We'll have this posted in the next few days. We do have one more episode coming up, and we encourage you to check in on this one as well. This one's going to be a lot of fun. This is the Women Who Run with Ralphie. And this is with Taylor Stratton, who's our Ralphie program manager, and a couple of our Ralphie runners. Talk about an interesting job in college, and I call it a job. It's a passion project, but I'll tell you something exciting about running behind a 1,200-pound buffalo. So they manage our live mascot, and they want to talk a little bit about the opportunities that are created for women in leadership development. So we hope you join us then. I do want to send you off with a segment from our CU libraries. They have resources that they've picked out that match the topic today, ways to further your education and your interest in this area. And so stay tuned for Claire Woodcock from the library. Thanks again for joining us.
Hi, I'm Claire Woodcock, Communications Specialist with the University Libraries, here on behalf of library faculty to share media recommendations in support of your educational journey. Professor Frey's presentation demonstrates that listening to marginalized voices can provide more space for collaboration in how we talk about social justice issues and movements. Keep listening with CU Boulder librarians Liz Novosel and Stacy Gilbert as they've surveyed a number of multimedia resources that they feel are making a difference. The Hate You Give is the debut novel of Angie Thomas. The book follows a teen girl's response to witnessing an incident of police brutality and racism in her community. The popular young adult novel was adapted for film in 2018 and also received critical acclaim. The award-winning podcast Code Switch from NPR explores race and identity in America. If you're new to the program and you're not sure where to start, Liz and Stacy definitely recommend the episode Nora's Last Magic. It's about how the Nickelodeon children's show Dora the Explorer helped usher in a wave of multicultural children's programming in the U.S. Your Black Friend by author Ben Passmore offers sharp social commentary on race and being Black in America in the form of an open letter. Not to be taken lightly, but Najeen Farsad's 2016 TED Talk offers socially conscious tips on how to use comedy when talking about social justice with peers. Girl Up, a campaign from the United Nations, offers a series of videos with tips on writing, public speaking, and other methods of storytelling to create social change. The Normal Heart is an HBO film about the HIV/AIDS crisis in New York City between the years 1981 and 1984, seen through the eyes of the founder of a prominent HIV advocacy group. Liz notes this film explores interpersonal, group, and organizational communications.
There are so many amazing resources about social justice out there that we found it really hard to choose just 6. We tried to select items that had to do with the vital role of communication for social justice movements geared towards many different audiences, but we encourage you to seek out more.
For more See You Where You Are media recommendations from Liz and Stacy, visit colorado.edu/libraries.